Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about action points. This is an interesting question. It comes from TactDB, who asks, where do you draw the line and how granular the action point should be for one's game? AP resolution, if you will. Some RPGs use a base 100 AP for every character, with equipment and status as modifiers. Everything you do from opening your backpack to raising your weapon costs AP. Some actions even activate an AP drain, like moving with your shield up costs more than just having it in default rest. Saving some AP allows for the chance to interrupt an opponent. Each game is different how it treats this, even if it even has interrupts. Some RPGs use the classic D&D. Some use a range of AP like Fallout, where agility becomes your action point. Interesting question. The reason I read all of it is the end where he talks about D&D versus Fallout. Okay, I've made Temple and I made Fallout, and then I made Arcanum, which had real-time and action points. So I've done a couple action point games, and I've done a turn-based game like Temple, which didn't really have action points, had a bar which determined action and move together. So I think there's a whole variety of ways you can handle this. And the thing I wanted to stress the most is action points have ranges, like I've talked about for skills or for damage numbers. And I have videos for each one of those that I'll link below. And a lot of what I say there is true for action points. I will dive in and talk about action points specifically to see how all those design kind of caveats that I have apply to action points. But I do want to say that I see this as less of a granularity issue and more of a how big do you want your action point pool size to be at maximum? And then almost all the decisions you make from there will be based on how big your action pool size is. So let's talk about the pros and cons of small action point pools versus big ones. I'll start with the small ones. And by small action point pool, I mean one whose maximum maybe 5 or 10, maybe even 20, but once you get to 20, you're starting to blur into big. And by the way, there are mid-range action point pools, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the extremes, because as always, the middle has all the pros and all the cons of both the extremes. And I know I always say this, but you have to go by what you're trying to do with your design, which I'm sure you've already written your goals at, and let your goals guide your decisions. So let's talk about action points with small pools. The advantage of having a small action pool is there are fewer actions per turn, probably, that the player can do. This makes it a lot easier for the player to grasp. It's like, if I can only do a couple things, then I got to think about what I want to do. And it also makes their choice matter. You're not going to do 10 different things. And then when you see what the resolution of that, you have to kind of figure out what of those 10 things was the wrong thing to do, or what should I have done in a different order. No, if you only have the action point to do 2 things, and then it turns out to be awesome, great. If it turns out to be bad, well, maybe you shouldn't have done one or both of those 2 things. It's not harder to figure out what mattered. Also, because of this, and this is true if you're worried about how long turn length lasts, either if it's multiplayer or if the enemies take turns individually. But turns will go a lot faster when you have a smaller action point pool. If on someone's turn they can only do 1 or 2 things, like move, like attack, like throw a spell, that turn will go a lot faster than if they can move, jump, dive into inventory, drink potion, throw a spell, run over here, take cover, and apply a bandage. If they can do all that, their turn is just naturally going to last a lot longer. So those are the advantages, I think, of small action point pools. There are disadvantages. The biggest one that I think of is there simply just isn't a lot of room for fine-tuning. If you have an action point pool of 5 or 10, and you're using that for movement, for item use, for ability use, getting an extra point in your action pool is amazing. But if something costs an extra point, like it costs you a little bit more to run, or it costs you a little bit more to move with your shield up, or you get these really 2 cool abilities and one costs 1 action point more than the other, that hurts when you only have 4 or 5 action points to spend. Conversely, and I'm saying this as a con, even though it could be a pro sometimes, but usually it's a con, bonuses have huge impact. Huge. Getting a +1 or +2 to your action point pool, or conversely a -1 or -2 to how much an action costs, that's a huge impact when you only have a few action points to spend per turn. Because of this, bonuses will have to be limited. You either have to not give them out frequently, or control the situations where they apply, or limit your bonus stacking. And you'll have to, if you don't know what I mean by all this, you've got a lot to learn if you pick a small bonus pool. You're going to have to think about this. And penalties go the same way. Small penalties hurt. And if penalties stack, they can hurt to the point of you can just make some things not possible. So if you have a small action point pool, you are going to have to go over everything in your game, the costs of things and the bonus and penalties that you plan to apply, and how you plan to apply them, not only in magnitude but stacking rules, with a fine-tooth comb, because you will have very little wiggle room for fine-tuning. So now let's talk about the pros and cons of action points with a big range. And by big range, I'm talking probably more than 20, let's say 100 action points, maybe even 1,000. There are games out there that do that. Let's start with the advantages of action point pools that are that big. Let's face it. The first one is pure feels. Some players just like big numbers. If there's no difference between going 0 to 10 and actions cost 1, 2, or 5 points, and going 0 to 100 and now actions cost 10, 20, or 50. Mathematically, those are identical, but there are some players that just gravitate towards, oh my goodness, 50 action points to do that, as opposed to 5. 5 out of 10 doesn't mean the same to them as 50 out of 100. I don't know why. It's just it's the paradox of big number thinking. But a big advantage that you will have that's actually mathematically valid is you have a lot of wiggle room for fine tuning. If you have a big action pool and you want to make walking, running, and jumping all cost slightly more than each other, you can do that and not make it so just penalizing to run everywhere or to jump a lot. If you have ability use and you want to make some weapons really fast or some spells really fast and others slow, so that you can really come up with a cool balance, like you could do this dagger 3 hits, but if you use this slow pole arm, you only get 1. You can do that because you have a big range of action points to play with. Similarly, you can have lots of bonuses come in from all kinds of places. You can have bonuses come from attributes, from abilities, from items that you wear or are wielding. And those things can stack. So you can have rules about how much they can stack and what the maximum stacking is. So players can make a lot more choices about what to use and what to wear, when they use a particular weapon, when they decide to cast a particular spell, because you have a bigger action pool range to play with, and you can have much more complicated and involved stacking rules. This subsequently leads to, I'm going to mark it as a pro, lots of choices for the player to make. There's lots of things they can think about on their turn about being able to do it, maybe even do it multiple times. They can also, if you support interrupting, like OP asked, having a big action pool makes you go, I think I'll save some for possibly blocking an attack later or interrupting somebody later who's near me. Because you have so many points that you're like, I don't mind. There's 100 points. I don't mind saving 10 or 20 of them for an interrupt. Now let's talk about the cons of that really big action point pool. I just mentioned having lots of choices. Lots of choices. That can be a con. First of all, it just makes your game a lot harder to learn. Now you can try to ameliorate that by designing for it and staggering choices. So early in the game, there are less choices to make. And once the player gets used to it, they have more choices to make later as they go up a level and get more options. But this will just be, it's just going to be harder to learn. And I'm not saying that this is something where you have to worry about losing casual players or being more appealing to hardcore players, but it's something you got to think about. Also, it's going to make your turn slower. Every time it's the player's turn, if the player has a lot of choices they're going to sit at that turn for a long time. And then when it becomes the enemy's choices, because there's lots of things they can do, their turn is going to go slower too. Even if they don't take up any extra time deciding it, they're going to do more and their turn is going to take longer. Now, I talked about having leftover points. You're more likely to have leftover points if you go with a big action pool. And the reason for that is you're likely to have a lot of actions that cost more than a point. So unless you reserve a 1 point action, players are often going to, I spent 15 here and 18 there, and that would have cost 20, but I have a -3, so it's only 17. And then they ended up with like 3 points left over, and nothing costs 3 points. So unless you put in a lot of action choices that cost only a point or two, it is very likely that players will end their turn with unusable points that are left over and not even enough to do an interrupt with. There are some players that are going to be super annoyed and super frustrated by that decision. They don't like action points that go unused. And it's just something that, you can't reason with them and go, well, look at all the cool things you got to do because of that big action point pool. They're just like, I hate that I had 2 action points left over out of 100. It annoys me. You can't argue player feelings like that. You can't argue them away. And then the other thing about a big action point pool is bonuses to that pool mean a lot less. If you have 100 action points and you get something that gives you an extra 2, it doesn't really mean much. And I've mentioned this before, but EverQuest had armor that ranged from 0 to 1,000. And there were people arguing over whether AC 56 versus 57 was better. And I'm like, I don't think you're going to notice it. But it's the same thing for a big action point pool. If you have 100 points to spend and you're trying to decide between something that costs 56 points and something that costs 57 points, is that really a decision that matters? So I put that as a con because it makes some things that would be a major choice point in a small action pool kind of something that the player can't really take into account with a big action pool. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, how do I decide whether I want a big action pool or a small one? This is no different than every other design choice you're going to make, and especially about balancing. You do want to keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, that if you make it too simple, your action point system, you're going to lose or bore the hardcore RPGers. But if you make it too hard and too complicated, you're going to lose / confuse casual players. They just want to have fun. And you're making them decide between dozens of actions every time it's their turn. And they're just like, I'm done with this. You can make choices that you could stagger, but some of the choices are hard. Like you could make a game that starts with a 10-point action pool and then at some point opens up into a 100-point action pool, but it will become a very different game at that point. And that's also, it's a major design change and you may lose people. I'm trying to think if I've ever played a game whose action point pool maximum changed dramatically over time. I could think of things where an attribute or an item may slightly give you a bonus to your maximum, but I can't think of any game that went from a 10-point to a 100-point pool at some point in the game just to become more complicated. So instead, my advice for here on trying to decide what to do is my advice on how to balance all the other features in your game. And there's a video on it, and I'll link it below, which is just stick a pin in it. Start with 10-point action pool. See how your items and skills and other actions play out. This is a good reason you want to make a prototype and you have a combat layer. You haven't invested a lot of time into art, into blocks and particular spell animations. You're just testing to see how it feels with a 10-point action pool. And if you can get all the other things you want, bonuses, player choice. And then if you can't, maybe make a 20-point action pool. Maybe go 50, maybe go 100. And then see how it works. But that's the stick a pin in it method, which is try different things and see how all the other choices you make play out. And if you don't like it, move the pin and try it again. That's the best advice I can give, and I hope, TactDB, this answers your questions.